Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a huge college football fan, and I especially enjoy watching and cheering for my alma mater, the University of Notre Dame. Go Irish. Now, I have to make a confession here. I'm not nearly as big of a fan of the pro game as I am of the collegiate game. And so I don't watch many pro games, but I do enjoy watching the Super Bowl. And like many Americans, I enjoy watching it for the ads, the commercials, as much as I do the game itself. This year, during the Super Bowl, there was a great commercial called God Made the Farmer. At least that's what I'm going to call it. I believe that's what it's called. And it was a commercial for Dodge Rams. Now, when I first saw this commercial, I was quite impressed because I'm constantly talking about the way in which we need to bring God into the public sphere and how God has been eliminated from the public sphere. Then all of a sudden, in the biggest commercial event of the year, the most watched event on television in the United States, the Super Bowl, is a commercial that's about 2 minutes long or so, constantly talking about God and how he made the farmer. Now, as I thought about this a little more, I said there is something disturbing about using religion to sell a pickup truck. But I want to bracket that aside for a second and just talk about the content of this commercial itself. Because actually most of the commercial wasn't geared at selling the pickup truck or even promoting the pickup truck. It was talking about a farmer and how God made the farmer and the sacrifices that the farmer makes. And it talks about how this farmer has put in 40 hours in his work week by Tuesday. And it talks about the grueling task that it is to be a farmer. Now, I'm currently in an assignment in upstate New York where I'm in a rural community, so I work with a lot of people who are themselves farmers. And I can say that this is very true of people who are farmers. It's hard and grueling work, and it involves a lot of sacrifice. Now, I want to take this image of the farmer and parallel it to the Eucharist. And I know you guys have got to be saying, Father, come on, what are you talking about here? How can you compare a farmer to the Eucharist? Now, to be clear, I'm not going to make the farmer out to be Jesus Christ, but I think there are certain parallels here that become important for us and certain Eucharistic themes that this commercial can be great for talking about. And that's what I'd like to do today. So one of the themes that we see is the way in which this farmer, he's going through all these sacrifices, and Paul Harvey, talks about many of the different sacrifices he makes. And then he has this very sentimental moment where he says that they're all kind of worthwhile as the farmer smiles when he's sitting down at the dinner table and hearing his son say, when I get older, I want to do what Dad does. I want to be like Dad. It's a very touching and sentimental thing. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in this video, though, is we see the sacrifices that the farmer makes, and he's making them for other people. And it culminates in this meal. He's sitting down at the dinner table with his son, and then he hears the touching story of how his son wants to be like him. It kind of shows that unity, that bond that's been created between father and son. And it's created as a result of the sacrifice that the father has made. Well, see, this is deeply Eucharistic, because the Eucharist is a meal and a sacrifice. It's become real trendy just to focus on it as a meal. We don't like to talk about sacrifice a lot. It's trendy not to talk about the Eucharist as a sacrifice. But in fact, it is. And this is true of any meal, if you think about it. A lot of us enjoy eating out and enjoy fine dining. But very rarely, as we enjoy these dinners that we have with friends and family, do we think about the sacrifices that people made in order for us to have these meals. We focus on the meal itself, and we tend to focus on the fellowship that it brings. And a lot of us can think to some of the greatest times that we've shared with our friends and family. And usually, a lot of these moments occur over meals. But very rarely do we think about the farmer who put in all the work to provide the grain that became the bread that became part of our meal, or that raised the animals that became part of our meal, or if you're vegetarian, that raised all the vegetables that became part of our meal. And very rarely do we even think about that sacrifice. Instead, we think of the meal and the fellowship and the communion that it brings about. But what we see, and what this commercial kind of helps us to see, is that that fellowship is brought about as a result of somebody's sacrifice, all the work that the farmer has done. And when we think about it in terms of our own society, we very rarely herald farmers as being people who are heroes or anything like that. Usually we uphold people like businessmen who have made billions of dollars, or athletes who are on television, or celebrities who have made it in the field of acting or something like that. But very rarely do we talk about people who put in the very hard work that makes some of the most intimate moments of our lives possible, such as the farmers and the sacrifices that they go through in order to make that happen. Well, the same is true in the Eucharist. When we only focus on it as a meal, we forget the fact that this meal is made possible because of a sacrifice, because Christ sacrificed himself so that he could become the bread that feeds us. And in doing so, he puts us in communion with everybody else who shares in this meal. And he ultimately puts us in communion with God, who is the one who we have the deepest longing in our lives for. We have this deep longing for relationship with God. You know, I find this true. Even there's a person who watches a lot of my videos who's a professed atheist, and many times he talks to me saying, you know, pray for me that I can find this desire for God that you have. And I find that very touching because in a sense he realizes that he needs some kind of a fulfillment by God in order to be truly fulfilled. And ultimately that's what we all need, and it's made possible in the Eucharist. That's what we're sharing in, is this intimate union with God and ultimately with one another as well. And this union too, this meal, is also healing in many ways too. And we can think about this too. How many times does reconciliation happen over a meal? You know, in my family, this happens all the time. I come from a big Italian family, and we can be arguing and bickering about a number of different things, from politics to church to, you know, who's right and who's wrong in our family and different family dynamics. But the minute somebody brings out the rigatoni, all of that ceases, and suddenly we're enjoying fellowship and communion with one another over this giant bowl of rigatoni. And that's the power of a meal, is it can be reconciling. Well, the Eucharist does this on a spiritual level for us. The Eucharist forgives us our sins, and it unites us with all the other people who participate in the Eucharist. You know, all the parishioners who we like and all those parishioners who we don't like. It unites us with the conservative Catholics, the liberal Catholics. All of us are united as we share in this meal. But this union that we share, this healing, this communion, is only made possible by a sacrifice. It wouldn't be possible had Christ not been the farmer of all of this, the one who toiled for all of this to come about, the one who gave his very life for us so that we could enjoy communion with one another and ultimately union with him and union with God. And in doing so, he brings about not just a smile on our face where we can look and say, you know, we want to be like him when we grow up, but he brings about our truest form of happiness, because all of us have this built-in desire for God. We have this built-in longing for something that's greater than ourselves, and that something is God, and that's made possible in the Eucharist, and it's made possible because of the sacrifice of Christ. So one of the nice things this commercial points to is the way in which our sacrifices have the ability to bring people into communion with one another, to be healing, and ultimately to bring us to our greatest form of satisfaction. And so I give this commercial 2 thumbs up, even though I am a little uncomfortable with evoking the name of God in order to sell a product.